including your experience.
Oh yeah, okay, well I'm Paul Kruger, by the way. Okay, yeah, and I'm one of the founding members and past presidents of the Vancouver Mycological Society. Quite active with the toxicology of mushrooms. So this is the manuscript, one of the only remaining original Aztec manuscripts showing some of the creation myth. And at the top there are deities holding pairs of mushrooms. And there's some of these little lines of evidence that show that there was ancient use of the mushrooms. Then a converted scribe, an Aztec scribe who converted to Christianity, worked with one of the conquering one of the Catholic dudes who was colonizing Mexico, and Sahuagin was interested in the history of the Aztecs, so we had this converted scribe do all sorts of paintings depicting pre-conquest Aztec life, and this shows the mushrooms being eaten in a religious ceremony, and the gods, or in this case the devil, appeared to the eater of the mushrooms. And the mushrooms are painted green in this, and that's a bit of an interesting thing, because to the Aztecs the color green indicated sacred. They had a pictographic written language, and to denote that something was sacred they color it green, because jade was considered the blood and the heart of the gods. Gold was the excrement of the gods, and so they're very puzzled by the Spanish fixation on their relatively worthless gold, and they didn't seem to have much interest in the truly sacred jade that the Aztecs highly prized. And now the various lines of evidence like this, including images of the mushroom stones, stories of the ancient manuscripts, and various tantalizing clues from historical sources, reached their way to R. Gordon Wasson, who was the vice president of J.P. Morgan Bank in the U.S. And he and his wife had developed what's now called the study of ethnomycology, or the use of mushrooms by humans. And this developed from their wedding. She was of Russian origin, he was a Bostonian of British stock. The British are notably mycophobic, or they're afraid of mushrooms. The British don't think much of mushrooms, other than the tweedy anorak wearing naturalist types who are also quite common in England. Most of the British don't consider, only one type of mushroom is a mushroom that comes wrapped in cellophane in a store, all the rest are toadstools. So he was horrified when his wife Valentina, on their honeymoon, gathered all sorts of wild mushrooms and was delighted, and they went back to the cabin and she cooked them up and ate them, and he refused to touch them. And he was really sure he'd wake up the next morning a widower, but he didn't. And they got talking, why do we have such different attitudes? So they decided to start studying human different cultural attitudes to mushrooms, founding ethnomycology. And this eventually led to them getting all these little tantalizing clues about a mushroom ritual surviving in Mexico. There's R. Gordon and Valentina Wasson in 1955 in Oaxaca, Mexico. And there is an article eventually that was published in Life magazine called Seeking the Magic Mushrooms of Mexico, 1957. And that unleashed onto the world this whole knowledge that there were hallucinatory mushrooms that were used traditionally. So they persuaded Maria Sabina to perform a ceremony for them. The ceremonies in which the magic mushrooms were used were very serious things. It was a religious practice, a healing practice, a medicinal practice, a spiritual practice. So it was not recreational. In this case, there was a young man in the village who was very sick, and the ceremony was held to try to divine the cause of his illness. And the way that the people in that culture perceive illness is it's caused by spirits, and that the mushrooms, everything's animate. The mushrooms have spirits in them, and through the mushrooms, Maria Sabina communicates with the spirits that are within and behind them. So that's the way she reaches the spirit realm, is through the intermediary of communicating through the mushrooms. And so here she's preparing them by passing them through sacred incense, then hands them out in pairs to the participants. Pairs representing the dualities of life, good, evil, day, night, male, female, the various dualities. People who think the world's simple and in two types, and people who don't, that sort of and so they had the ceremony. She chanted in the Huatl language, which is a dialect of Aztec, or it's a Mazatec, actually, dialect of Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztec. And she also rhythmically slaps her body and her hands together to create a percussive rhythm, to which she does these chanting in the traditional language with lots of Christian elements woven throughout it. So she
Paul, is all this in the book, or were you there?
Yeah, it's all in the book.
Oh, okay.
I've actually got a recording, full-length recording of the ceremony. But it was recorded on audio tape, movie, film, still photography, and thoroughly documented. And so the mushrooms tell her that the young man must die. The page of his fate is written in the book of life. There's nothing the spirits can do to alter that. And here she's beseeching with the mushrooms to change that, and they tell her no, there's nothing that can be done. And the young man did die apparently a week or two after the ceremony, because there were no Western European physicians, modern physicians in the area. We don't know what the young man was ill of or died from. So Wasson was well connected. He was a somewhat wealthy man, and he was able to round up a lot of consultants and experts to help him out with investigations into the mushrooms, including this man who is the Roger M. with the Natural History Museum in Paris, and they went through the hills looking at the various mushrooms that people reported using, described them. Most of them new to science, so they gave them names like Psilocybe mexicana, Aztecorum, Mazatecorum, Zapotecorum, after the various peoples that live in the area, or the landscape, references to the landscape. And they gathered enough of the material, worked out ways to cultivate them, to send off material to Basel, Switzerland, where the infamous Dr. Albert Hofmann
Infamous?
studied, yes, or famous. He's infamous for being a somewhat wobbly bicycle rider. And that's a little in-joke for those not familiar with the history of hallucinogens. I might have to explain that. So he discovered by accident LSD, and very famously somehow contaminated himself. He either had some spilled on a surface that he got in contact with, or inhaled droplets, or somehow he got dosed with LSD, the first person to take LSD accidentally or on purpose. And
in My Problem Child, it says it was by design.
By design, okay, yeah. The story was it was by accident, but maybe carelessness. But he did a bicycle ride through Basel, and under the full effects of the LSD, which left an impression on him. And so LSD was derived from compounds found in a fungus called ergot that grows as a parasite on grains and other grasses. And he managed to isolate ergotamine, which was then biosynthesized into LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. And this became famous or infamous as a powerful hallucinogen. And he just happened to have the only lab, the expertise, the compounds and various materials on hand to do the research needed to identify and characterize the active compounds, the psilocybin mushroom, which turned out to be surprisingly closely related to LSD. It's an indole alkaloid, which is called 4-phosphoryloxydimethyltryptamine. And it's very closely related to serotonin, one of our endogenous neurochemicals. It intermediates various neurological functioning, including dream states and sleep and various things like that. So it's not at all surprising that they should have profound effects on the human mind. They tried to administer them to laboratory animals, couldn't get much of an effect until they had administered whopping amounts of the substance, and then they'd get toxic effects. So eventually they decided they had to test it on themselves, and they found, whoop, yeah, it was active. They're able to identify psilocybin as being the very active compound. And psilocybin has a phosphorus in the molecular structure, which is very unusual for that group of compounds. Up to the time, there was known indole that had a phosphorus involved in the structure. So they knew that this could be a very interesting novel group of compounds. So they focused a lot of energy on researching it. And it is taken into the body, and in your gut, the phosphorus is knocked off with enzymes that are in your digestive tract, converting the psilocybin to psilocin, which is the compound which gets into the brain and is close enough to serotonin to replace the serotonin in the receptors and have the powerful psychological effect. So this is, some mushrooms will come on very quickly because they have lots of psilocin, which acts directly. Others may come on slowly because they have a lot of psilocybin in relation to psilocin, especially when they're fresh, or no, when they're dried, sorry. And so it takes a while for your gut to dephosphorylize the psilocybin, converting it into psilocin. So you have a delay of quite some time before the effect comes on. Unlike LSD, which can take an hour or 2 hours or 3 to take effect, LSD appears to get into the body, it gets into the bloodstream, disperses through the body, and then is eliminated from brain and nervous tissue before the first effect comes on. Hence there's often a delay of an hour or more before any effect is felt from it. LSD. With psilocybin, it's as soon as that psilocin molecule gets into the brain tissue that the change happens. And I don't know about other people, but to me it's more comforting to have a direct molecular effect than to have some mysterious getting in there, buggering around with your brain and getting out before you have an effect. So I have a great preference for psilocybin as a potential therapeutic over LSD because I think it might have less problems and is more compatible with the human nervous system.
Paul, question.
Yeah.
What's the relationship between psilocin and DMT?
Very similar. Well, DMT is an N-dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah.
So this is just this other, the fourth position, there's the phosphoryloxy group tacked on. I can't remember what's in that position with DMT.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. It's a pure ring.
Yeah, okay. So that, it's much more direct. The
No, but I
DMT
asked about psilocin. So the phosphorus gets knocked off and you're left with
Oh,
a
yeah.
hydroxy?
Yeah, I believe
Okay.
so. Yeah. Yeah. Or I don't know if it's, yeah, okay. So, and then they were able, Sandoz was able to biosynthesize, to synthesize, chemosynthesize the psilocybin, marketed it as Indocybin, distributed it widely throughout the world to psychiatrists, psychologists, physicians who would be interested in trial tests of it on human subjects or animals if they so chose. And so it was widely distributed, and it began to show great promise. There were experiments done on recidivist prisoners in the prison system, people that had profound alcohol dependency, nasty, brutal, violent people, and they found really amazing changes in attitude in many of these people who were in the position they were in because they were damaged themselves. Familiar story.
So it stopped recidivism?
In many cases, the people became, yeah, Yeah, the amount of repeat offending went down in that group that experienced it due to lifestyle changes and just attitude changes towards life. And then a lot of this research that was done on the mushrooms of Mexico resulted in 2 great big publications in French, unfortunately, from the Museum of Natural History in Paris, which are classics to this day in the field of ethnobiology, which is the use of things by humans, living things by humans. The mushroom research stands out as one of the most extensive, intensive, thoroughly done studies of something that had been recently recognized as being used by humans. So they studied the chemistry, the biology, cultivation techniques, the microscopic characters of the fungi themselves. They studied the language, the linguistics of the chants, the musicology of the chants and how musically it was structured, and various other aspects of this in a very interesting way. And sufficient that R. Gordon Wasson has been honored in a series of postal stamps from one of these countries whose only export is postage stamps and currency bills, maybe. So this is Tonga or Tongo?
Togo.
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 Yeah, I get confused. I got all confused because one time I thought that was the South Pacific island Tonga. And I know somebody who turned on the Tongan community to magic mushrooms. He was visiting the South Pacific island and found magic mushrooms growing out of cow manure, cow dung, and ate them. And the kids, local kids, noticed this activity and asked him what he was up to. And he showed them the mushrooms, so they took a bunch home to give to their families. And then by the time I think he left and came back the next year, and he found that the whole island had substituted the mushrooms for the kava kava that they did the traditional kava ceremony with. Now the whole community was buzzing out on the mushrooms. Cultural contamination. It's against the first directive of the Star Trek Enterprise. Starship Enterprise. So anyway, Togo is a country in Africa.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's quite an honor to have a series of postage stamps published about magic mushrooms. Now, it's believed that magic mushrooms and other hallucinogenic plants and natural substances might be responsible for evolutionary changes in the human brain, body, and cultural behavior.
That's Terence McKenna, right?
Really, yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps the whole concept of religion has its origins in the use of hallucinogens by different cultures. And so we find very suggestive rock paintings in the Sahara Desert, in what's now high desert, used to be green, lush pasture land with grasslands with large herds of large animals.
How long ago was that?
The rock paintings in Tassili Plateau are believed to be, what's going on here? What the hell?